Hi everyone. So this week we're moving on from space to talk about time. We're going to spend actually the remainder of term talking about topics concerning time. This week we'll be talking about Mctaggart's well-known argument for the unreality of time, that time doesn't exist. Then next week we'll be looking at the ontology of time. Assuming that there is something corresponding to the notion of time. What exactly within time does exist? So, does the present exist all by itself, or does the past and or the future also exist? And then we'll be going on to look at the possibility of time travel, whether that leads to logical or metaphysical paradoxes. Okay, but this week's topic is Mctaggart's argument. So I'll switch to the slides. So let me just make this full screen. So Mctaggart advances this argument, which is quite a surprising conclusion, namely that time doesn't exist, contrary to what we might ordinarily think. And it's been enormously influential, partly, I suppose, because the conclusion's so surprising. But it's sort of helped, in a way, frame the debate about the philosophy of time ever since. So most people reject Mctaggart's conclusion. They reject Mctaggart's claim, his conclusion that time is not real. Nevertheless, one thing that's been very interesting is that people reject his conclusion on different grounds. So he offers this argument for the conclusion, and the argument, as we'll see, appears to be logically valid. That is to say, it seems that if one endorses all of the premises, then one is forced to endorse the conclusion. So the validity most people haven't objected to. So then the question is, if you're going to deny the conclusion, then you've got to deny one of the premises. And interestingly enough, different people have denied different premises, and this has sort of set up different camps in the philosophy of time ever since. So we'll come back to that towards the end of the lecture, but first it's important to understand Mctaggart's argument. So what Mctaggart says is that events in time, and also moments in time, so you can have different moments in time, and perhaps you have events that occur during those moments. So he thinks events and moments can be distinguished in one of two ways. So we can distinguish or order events according to their A properties. So A properties and B relations he talks about. These are just terms that he's invented, kind of technical terms, if you like. People still use this terminology. A and B doesn't have any particular significance. It's just a label. So he says that the A properties are properties like being past, being present, or being future. But also that there are sort of further distinctions that you can make among A properties. So you can have being distant past, or being 2 days past, being distant future, being 1 year future, being an hour future, and so on. Those are all A properties. On the other hand, he thinks you can distinguish events in time according to what he calls B relations. So some events are earlier than others, later than others, or simultaneous with others. Those are B relations. And again, you can have more fine-grained B relations, so you could have being 2 days earlier than, or being a year earlier than, or being 2 millennia later than. Those would all be B relations. Now, the A properties, Mctaggart observes, are impermanent. They're not permanent. So for each event or moment, there are going to be times at which it's future, times at which it's present, and times at which it's past. So each moment or each event is going to possess each of these properties: futureness, presentness, and pastness. Maybe there's an exception. If there's a first moment in time or a last moment in time, then maybe there are some events that only have two of these properties. So if there was a first moment in time, then that moment and any events occurring at that moment would be present and then past. They would never be future. Likewise, if there were a last moment in time, that moment and any events occurring within it would be future and then present, but would never be past. But so events are going to, strictly speaking, possess at least two of these properties. If time doesn't have a beginning or end, then all events are going to, it looks like, possess all of these properties. And even if time does have a beginning and end, then most events are going to have all of these properties, and all events are going to have at least two of these properties. By contrast to the A properties, which are not permanent, the B relations, Mctaggart says, are permanent or unchanging. So he observes that if one event E is earlier than another event F, then E is always going to be earlier than F. So, for instance, if the financial crisis is at some time earlier than the COVID pandemic, then that's true at all times. It's always going to be true that the financial crisis was earlier than the COVID pandemic. So this earlier than relation, and likewise with the later than relation, is permanent or unchanging. Now, as I suggested, Mctaggart thinks that these two ways of distinguishing points in time correspond to two ways of providing an order of events or moments in time. So you can order events according to their A properties, and this results in what Mctaggart calls the A series. So how distantly past they are, whether they're present, and how distantly future they are. So, if time is finite in the past direction, we could say that at the beginning of the series come the most distant past events, and then progressively nearer and nearer past events, and then we get the present events, and then the near future, and then the distant future, and so on. Even if time isn't finite, then we can still provide this order according to how distant past events are, whether they're present, and how distant future they are. Another way to order events or moments in time is according to their B relation. So this produces what Mctaggart calls the B series. So if there's a first moment in time, then there are going to be some events that are earlier than all others. And these would go at the beginning of the series. Then there are events that are just a bit later than those and earlier than all the rest, and they'll come next in the series, and so on as we get the progressively later and later events. Again, we don't need to require a first moment in time to produce this order or a last moment in time. We can just order events according to progressively earlier and earlier. So these are two ways of producing an ordering of events in time. Now, you might have noticed that these two ways of ordering events are presumably going to produce the same order. They're going to order events in the same way, whether we do it according to their A properties or their B relations. So although the ultimate order might be the same, these can be viewed as two ways of producing that order or establishing that order. Okay, so that's a bit of background. So because this notion of the A series and A properties, and then the B series and B relations is going to be important for Mctaggart's discussion. We're actually now in a situation or a position to state Mctaggart's argument, and we'll discuss it further once we've stated it. So Mctaggart's argument could be seen as having three premises, and then one intermediate conclusion, which I've labelled 4, and then the overall conclusion of the argument, which I've labelled C, just for conclusion. So the premises, firstly, there can be no time without change. Secondly, the A series is necessary for change. So there can't be any time without change, and the A series is needed for change. Thirdly, the A series is contradictory. Then comes the intermediate conclusion or lemma, there is no change. And then comes the overall conclusion, time does not exist. So the intermediate conclusion 4 is derived from premises 2 and 3. So 2 says the A series is needed for change. 3 says the A series is contradictory. So the idea is, well, if the A series is contradictory, then it can't exist. But if, according to 2, it's needed for change, then there can't be any change because it's needed for change, but it can't exist. So this intermediate conclusion 4 is taken to follow from 2 and 3. Then the overall conclusion is taken to follow from premise 1 and the intermediate conclusion 4. So 1 says there can't be time without change. 4 says there's no change. So if there's no change and there can't be time without change, then it looks like there's no time. Or in other words, time doesn't exist. Okay, so that's Mctaggart's argument. Most people have taken this to be logically valid in the sense that if you accept premises 1 through 3, then you're forced to accept the overall conclusion C. You're forced to accept 4, and therefore you're forced to accept the overall conclusion C. So those people, and there have been many, who have sought to resist the conclusion that time doesn't exist, tend to, rather than challenging the validity of the argument, challenge the truth of the premises. And as I said, different people reject different premises. So let's examine these premises. So premise 1, there can be no time without change. Now, Mctaggart actually doesn't offer much by way of argument for this premise. He seems to take it to be reasonably obvious. So his thought is that a universe in which nothing changed, in which genuinely nothing changed, would be timeless. So that might strike you as odd. So I suppose if you try to imagine a changeless universe, you might think that you can. So at least if I try to imagine it, then I sort of imagine kind of looking out on, this sort of frozen universe, and, I wait and nothing happens, and, maybe I get increasingly bored because nothing's going on. Now, to me, it might seem that that is a universe in which, nothing goes on. There's a period of time over which nothing happens. So nothing's happening, but time's still elapsing. So I'm getting bored, right? Because nothing's going on for a long time, which suggests that time can elapse even though nothing's happening. So that might seem to undermine Mctaggart's premise 1. But Mctaggart would reasonably say, well, you're not properly imagining a changeless universe. What you're imagining is yourself put into a universe where not much is going on, but there is something that's changing, namely your mental states, right? So there are some, when I am imagining myself in this universe, and I'm imagining the thoughts that I'd have and the perceptions that I would have. I'm imagining getting increasingly bored, looking around me, seeing that nothing's going on. And so actually my thoughts are changing. So this universe isn't a truly timeless one. So a truly timeless one would be, truly changeless one. A truly changeless one would be one in which also, if you like, the thoughts of conscious observers are frozen, as well as the material universe. Okay, so then maybe it looks a bit more plausible that premise one might be true, but that's not to say it's without controversy, and there's a debate over whether it's true. So between Sidney Shoemaker and Robin Le Poitevin. So I won't go into that debate in here, but for those who are interested, those papers are on the further reading list for this week. So what about premise 2 then? The premise 2 says the A series is necessary for change. Now, here Mctaggart provides an argument why we should accept this premise, rather than more or less taking it as obvious as he does with premise 1. Mctaggart thinks that the A series is necessary for change because the B series on its own isn't enough. In particular, events don't change with respect to their B relations. The B relations are permanent or unchanging. So, for instance, the financial crisis being earlier than the COVID pandemic, that's a permanent or unchanging state. So neither the financial crisis nor the COVID pandemic ever changes in respect of that relation. Now, the A series, on the other hand, allows change, Mctaggart thinks, because events do change with respect to their A properties, on the assumption that there are A properties. So, for instance, the COVID pandemic went from being future to present. Hopefully, sometime soon, it will go on to be past. So, it looks like it's genuinely changing with respect to its A properties. So that's why Mctaggart thinks that the A series, the A properties, are needed for change. Now, you might think, well, actually, do we need either A properties or B relations for change? Couldn't we have events changing in other sorts of properties other than their A properties, right? So you might say, well, for instance, consider an apple. An apple changes by going, for instance, from green to red to brown. So it's green before it's ripe, and then red once it's ripe, and then brown once it's decayed or started to decay. So that's a change. It's a change in just regular properties, colour properties, rather than A properties. What Mctaggart would say is that actually we can think of this as a change in the A properties of various states of the apple. So his idea would be that the green state of the apple changes in its A properties in that it goes from being present to past. The red state goes from being future to present to past, and the brown state goes from being future to present. So this change in regular properties, like colour properties, always corresponds to a change in A properties. So that's why he thinks that A properties are really essential for any sort of change. Okay, so that's Mctaggart's argument for premise 2. What about premise 3? So premise 3 is that the A series is contradictory. And therefore he's going to conclude can't exist. So his point here is that the A properties, for instance, the properties of being past, present, and future, are incompatible. So something can't be past, present, and future. But he thinks to suppose that there is an A series is to suppose that every event has all of these properties, or at least, maybe if there's a first and last moment in time, then every event has at least two of these properties, but most will have all. So the problem is then that the supposition that this is A series, that events have A properties, leads to contradiction, because if we suppose they exist, then that's to suppose that each event or each moment will have at least two and possibly three of these, but they're each incompatible with the other. So the supposition that there's an A series leads to contradiction, so the A series can't exist, it's contradictory. So that's Mctaggart's argument for premise 3. Now, just before sort of evaluating premise 3, we can just note that, if Mctaggart's right, that he's established premises 1, 2, 3, and if, as it seems, the argument's valid, then he's successfully established that time doesn't exist. Okay. So, premise 3 perhaps strikes at least some people as the most dodgy. Now, that's not to say people haven't resisted the other two. And in particular, on reading Mctaggart's argument for premise 3, an objection might come to mind. Now, Mctaggart anticipates this objection. He calls it the natural objection. It's a natural objection for one to have. So, the natural objection to premise 3 is that, well, is there really a contradiction here? So, suppose that the A series exists. There are genuine A properties. Well, okay, it might be true that an event E has the properties of being past, present, and future. And it might be that the properties of being past, present, and future are somehow incompatible. Right? However, you might reasonably say, what would be genuinely incompatible is for an event to have these three properties all at the same time. Right, that would be a contradiction. An event E can't be past, present, and future all at the same time. There's a genuine contradiction. However, you might say, no one supposes that to be the case, right? What we suppose is that events have these properties successively. They have them at different times. So E is present, will be past, and was future. So no one's saying that E has all of these incompatible properties at the same time, and it's only if it had them all at the same time then that would result we'd get a contradiction. Okay, so that's what Mctaggart calls a natural objection to his argument for the third premise. However, so he anticipates it, and he thinks there's a problem with this natural objection. Specifically, he thinks that this objection involves a circularity or a regress. So his point is that in order to explain how it is that the A properties are consistent with one another, or how an event E can consistently exhibit all of these properties, you have to fall back on the notion of time, right? So think how the natural objection goes. So Mctaggart said it's a contradiction to suppose that an event E is past, present, and future. The natural objector says, well, it would only be a contradiction if I supposed that the event E has these properties all at the same time. So there they've invoked time again. So what they'll say is that the event E doesn't have these properties all at the same time. Rather, at one time, it has the property of being future. At another time, it has the property of being present. And at still another time, it has the property of being past. So the natural objector is relying on this distinction of time So in the past, the event was future. Currently, it's present, and in the future, the event will be past. So relying upon this very notion of time in order to try to explain away the contradiction. So Mctaggart's going to claim that the natural objector has gone round in a circle because the A series is needed to explain how time is possible. And yet the natural objector needs to presuppose the notion of time in order to show that the A series is coherent. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, this is another way of saying the same thing. So Mctaggart's argued that it can't be that E is future, E is present, and E is past. That's a contradiction. The natural objector points out that E was future, so it's not the case that E is future, is present, and is past. Rather, it's the case that E was future, is present, and will be past. But these tensed expressions, was, is, will be, are presupposing the existence of time, which is the very thing that Mctaggart takes the A series to be needed for. So Mctaggart thinks that the natural objection fails. So the notion of an A series involves a contradiction, so there can't be an A series, so time doesn't exist. Okay. So one thing that he takes to remain in terms of his overall argument strategy is to explain away the appearance that time exists. So it seems that, we do regard the world as having some sort of temporal structure. So it seems to us that time passes and time exists, and so if Mctaggart's concluded on the basis of this argument that it doesn't exist. Now, so long as we don't have an explanation for why it seems to us that time exists, there might be a residual skepticism that we have about Mctaggart's argument. We might think, well, something must have gone wrong with Mctaggart's argument, even if we can't quite put our finger on what's gone wrong with it. So what Mctaggart does is he tries to explain why we should think that our experience of time is illusion. So he tries to give reasons beyond his argument that time doesn't exist for why we should think our experience of time is an illusion. So, as I said, the sort of main reason we might believe in A properties like presentness, pastness, and futureness is that we seem to experience the world as having these properties. So, you might think, for instance, our experience of the present is different from our experience of the past and the future. So somehow the present seems to be more immediately perceivable. The past, we only have kind of indirect evidence of via memories or records. And the future, on the other hand, we might have very little evidence for. We might be able to predict, but maybe not as comfortably as we can retrodict what happened in the past, for instance. So our sort of experience and our epistemic state seems to point towards this A series, this significant distinction between past, present, and future. But Mctaggart wants to argue that it's an illusion, so he wants to say that our impressions of time couldn't correspond to anything genuinely objective. So although we might have these impressions or experiences, there's no way they could correspond to anything objective, even setting aside his argument for the unreality of time. And the reason he thinks that is that our experience, our temporal experience, is variable and subjective. In other words, what he calls the specious present, or what we might call the experiential present, is variable and subjective and couldn't correspond to anything that's objective. So, for instance, the experiential present, and this is quite well established in experimental psychology, is not an instant, but rather an interval. So there are experiments that can confirm this, that show that you can't, for instance, human beings can't distinguish between the time at which one sound was emitted and the time at which another sound was emitted, even if the second sound was emitted after the first sound. Suppose these two sounds were emitted at the same distance from the human subject of the experiment, then provided the temporal interval between the emission of the two sounds is sufficiently close, then the subject of the experiment experiences the sounds as simultaneous, and so fails to distinguish between the times at which they were emitted. So this suggests that what we experience as the present isn't an instant, but it's an interval. Now you might think, well, if there's an objective present, then surely that's got to be an instant rather than an interval, a moment in time rather than an interval of time. We'll come back to why we might think that. Another point that Mctaggart makes is, and again this is quite well backed up by the experimental psychology literature, is that the experiential present, not only is it not an instant, but rather an interval, but also it's not constant. So there are psychological experiments that show what might be called experiential time dilation and experiential time contraction. So in other words, the interval of time that's experienced as the present can be lengthened or shortened in certain circumstances. One interesting circumstance in which it's shortened appears to be when the subject regards themselves as being in danger. So you might have experienced this yourself. So sometimes when we're in dangerous situations, we get the strange experience of time appearing to slow down. So in other words, and this is backed up by the experimental evidence, we seem able to make discriminations between moments in time or events in time that would normally experience as simultaneous. And the sort of hypothesis is that, well, there's maybe an evolutionary explanation for this. So when we're in danger, it's going to be useful for us to make finer discriminations between events in time because it enables us to react more effectively or more quickly. Interestingly, also in some circumstances, we experience events to occur actually in the reverse order from the order in which they do occur. So there are some experiments that will show that, for instance, if sound A is emitted before sound B, then in appropriate circumstances, the human observer, even if these sounds are emitted at the same distance from the observer, will in fact experience B to occur earlier than A. So some of this experimental psychology evidence is outlined in an interesting paper on the further reading list by David Eagleman. So if you're interested, you can follow that up. So, I mean, this sort of all points in the direction that the experiential present, the specious present, couldn't plausibly correspond to an objective present. So I've already said that it's plausible that the objective present is a point or a moment, an instant, rather than an interval. This might seem plausible. There's actually also an argument for this given by the medieval philosopher St. Augustine. So he says that, well, if the objective present were an interval of time, then it would have earlier and later parts. So there would be parts of the present that were in the past of other parts of the present. But this just seems like a contradiction, or at least so St. Augustine thought, and so seems quite plausible. So we might, with Mctaggart, think, well, what reason do we have to believe in the existence of an objective present, which has no systematic relation to the experiential present? So the idea was, well, Mctaggart's given an argument that time doesn't exist, but, it seems to us like time does exist, so we might think there's something that's gone wrong with Mctaggart's argument. Now, Mctaggart's essentially argued that, well, those appearances, our temporal phenomenology, the appearance that time exists, couldn't be veridical anyway. They couldn't correspond to anything objective anyway, his argument notwithstanding. So we have no reason really to be suspicious of his argument. Okay, so that's more of the same. So it's not so clear that our experience of time provides any evidence for the existence of time. Okay, but you might sort of push back against Mctaggart. So you might say, well, so one objection would be that if we experience the illusion of time, then at least something is changing, presumably, namely our experience. So, for instance, if we think about these psychological studies, well, they talk about time appearing to go slowly or quickly. They talk about us experiencing two sounds at the same time, or maybe even the first sound occurring after the second sound. All of this evidence seems to presuppose that the conscious states of the human subject change, right? So in order to make sense of the sort of rate at which time appears to pass to us, presumably we're appealing to changes in the conscious state of the subject, right? So they're successively experiencing different events in time, and how finally discriminating those experiences are. So it looks like you might say at least something's changing, namely the conscious experience is the observer. So then it looks like, well, something is changing, right? And so there must be something wrong with Mctaggart's argument. So if change is needed for time, well, maybe that's not so much of a problem. We do have change. And then we can argue about whether that's because the A series isn't contradictory after all. And you might also think that, well, maybe our subjective experience is to some extent illusory, but it might be possible to exaggerate the significance of this, right? So you might say, well, okay, sure, our experiential present isn't an instant, maybe it's variable, maybe it's sometimes shorter intervals of time are experienced as present, maybe sometimes longer. But you might say, well, that might be so, but that it doesn't follow that it's not sort of roughly tracking something objective. So, maybe it does vary, but maybe it varies around an objective point in time that corresponds to the present. So a sort of analogy would be, Well, you know, when it comes to regular perceptions of the external world and external objects, sometimes we're subject to illusions. But it doesn't follow, and maybe so. I mean, for instance, Descartes. For those of you who study Descartes, points out that a square tower viewed from a distance can appear round, or maybe it was the other way around. I can't remember. Or a stick that's half in water, half submerged in water, will appear bent. So these are just regular visual illusions. So we occasionally suffer some visual illusions, and maybe also more generally there are reasons to thinking our perceptions of the external world don't always correspond to anything objective. So some of you may have come across the primary and secondary qualities discussion. So color is an example of a so-called secondary quality. So our experience of color, the idea is, can't correspond to anything in the world that resembles that experience. So you might have a sort of subjective experience of redness, but the argument is that nothing resembling that experience exists in the objective world, right? Because this is all just a matter of light being reflected, different wavelengths of light being reflected and absorbed by different surface textures of objects. So what's objectively out there in the world is light, wavelengths of light, the surface textures of objects, not things that objectively resemble our experience of redness. So you might say, look, yes, human experience doesn't correspond, perfectly to anything objective. And maybe sometimes we're subject to illusions, but let's not go too far and conclude on that basis. So you might say, when it comes to those examples, you might think it's sort of going overboard to say, well, the external world doesn't exist, because sometimes our experiences are illusory and maybe they're never perfectly representative of what the external world is like. You might nevertheless think it's too far to reject the existence of the external world. And likewise, when it comes to the illusoriness of our temporal experience, you might think, well, yes, okay, sometimes we are subject to illusions. Maybe it never perfectly corresponds to anything that could be objective, but it would be going too far again just to say that, well, because our perception's imperfect, then we should just reject the existence of time. Okay. Now, okay, so even if we say that, even if we somehow say, well, we say that maybe our experience of time does provide us with some reason to believe in the existence of time, just as maybe our experience of the external world, even though it's imperfect, provides us with some reason to believe in the external world. Nevertheless, when it comes to time, we're confronted with Mctaggart's argument, which seemed like a valid argument that time doesn't exist and doesn't depend upon any premise about what we experience. Now, as I've said, most people reject his conclusion that time's unreal, but it's interesting how they reject it. So, given that it seems to be valid, they've got to reject one of the premises, it seems. So, this has divided philosophers into so-called A theorists and B theorists. These are the sort of dominant responses to Mctaggart. So the A theorist, as the name suggests, believes that there really are A properties. So they're going to reject the idea that the A series is incoherent. They're going to say that there are genuine A properties, past, present, and future. That these aren't anyway reducible to B relations, that they'd normally say there's genuine change, which corresponds to change of A properties, and that the passage of time is a real and objective feature of the world and not an illusion. So there's genuine change in A properties. This gives us change. This gives us time and the passage of time as things go from being future to present to past. So they'll reject premise 3 normally of Mctaggart's argument. So they reject the idea that the A series is contradictory. Many of them endorse premise 2. Many of them think that the A series is needed for change and the B relations, the B series isn't enough, but they think the A series is not contradictory, and so there's no problem in allowing for change. And of course, they might, they can do all that and be perfectly comfortable with the idea that there can be no time without change. So they can be perfectly accepting of premise 1, provided they reject premise 3. They can accept premises 1 and 2, and still avoid Mctaggart's conclusion that time doesn't exist. Okay, so they might endorse the natural objection to premise 3. They might say it's not contradictory provided the events don't have the the different A properties all at the same time. But what do they say in response to Mctaggart's response to the natural objection? So Mctaggart's response, remember, was that, well, it's circular, right? So we have to rely upon time in order to explain how the A properties aren't inconsistent. Well, one thing the A theorists might say is that, well, just because we can't explain away the appearance of contradiction without circularity doesn't show that there is a genuine contradiction, right? So normally they'd say, look, that time is a primitive, right? Time is a basic notion. It's fundamental. So there's no reason to expect that you should be able to explain what time is in terms of other things, right? Without re-invoking time. Otherwise, it wouldn't be basic, right? Anything that's basic, the point is that it can't be reduced or explained away in other terms. So the fact that when we try to explain what time is, then we end up falling back on the notion of time should be no surprise, right? So maybe you can draw an analogy with other theories of other philosophically interesting phenomena. So maybe things like knowledge, or maybe causation. So there are some people who argue that these things are just basic, they're just primitive, they can't be explained in terms of other things, or they can't be entirely explained in terms of other things. So they would say, well, if you're just not going to be able to give a non-circular account of these phenomena, but that doesn't show that they don't exist. Just because you can't reduce knowledge to something else doesn't show that knowledge doesn't exist. Just because you can't reduce causation to something else doesn't show that causation doesn't exist. And they might say the same with respect to time, right? Just because you can't reduce it to something else, so any explanation of what it is going to end up being circular, doesn't show that it doesn't exist. So as distinct from the A theorists, so the B theorists, the B theorists normally take the B series to be all there is to time, but they normally take the B series to be enough for time, right? So they reject the A properties, but they endorse the B relations, and they take the B relations to be enough for time. So let's just go back to Mctaggart's argument. They will often endorse premise 3. They'll often side with Mctaggart that the A series is contradictory, but they'll normally reject either premise 1 or premise 2. So they'll normally, most of them reject premise 2. So they might be comfortable with the idea that there can be no time without change, but they reject the idea that the A series is necessary for change. They might say actually the B relations are enough. But it's possible that they should accept premise 2 and reject premise 1. So they might say, well, yeah, there can be time without change, and the B relations give us time without change. But more normally, they'd say that actually the B relations give us change, and so reject premise 2. Okay, so B theorists will normally accept that we can legitimately talk as though there were A properties. It's just that that talk doesn't correspond to any genuine A properties in the world. So they'll acknowledge that we can sensibly talk about it presently being the year 2021, for instance, the COVID pandemic being present, the financial crisis being past, Elon Musk's proposed Martian outpost colony thing being future. But the B theorist will say that this talk about A properties is a sort of indexical talk. So an indexical is an expression whose meaning depends upon the context in which it's uttered. Many spatial expressions, like here and 1 mile away, are indexical expressions. So if I say, for instance, here, then I refer to a different place than if any of you says the word here. So the B theorist is going to say now or presently is similarly an expression that's an indexical. So if I say presently, if I say the present or now, then I refer to the time at which I was making this recording. If any of you watching this recording says now, then you're going to be referring to a different time. Right. So the B theorist's idea is that there's no special property of nowness, just that there's no special property of here-ness, but that now or presently or the present is just an indexical. So, for instance, they'd say that likewise, if I said that the financial crisis is past, or the example I've got on the slide, the Great Depression is past, there's no genuine property of pastness. All that sentence is doing is reporting a tenseless B series fact that the Great Depression is earlier than the time that we're speaking. So we can make sense of this expression without invoking a sort of genuine metaphysically weighty property of pastness. Rather, we understand that sentence just as reporting an earlier than relation. The Great Depression, or if you like, the financial crisis, is earlier than the time we're speaking. So we can reduce away, in other words, tense. We can explain the truth values of tense sentences in terms of tenseless B facts. Now, for the B theorist, they're liable to say that time doesn't really pass. So there's no genuine sort of property of presentness that entities, moments in time, or events successively instantiate. So they'll normally agree with Mctaggart that the appearance of the passage of time is an illusion. Now you might wonder, well, but isn't the passage of time somehow essential to the notion of time? Certainly that seems to be what Mctaggart thought. So I mean, maybe there's potentially an objection there. However, the B theorist is actually likely to go on the offensive against the A theorist here, because the A theorist says, look, there's genuine passage of time. This corresponds to moments or events in time successively exhibiting the A properties. So time passes. But the B theorist might say, well, look, A theorist, if time passes, then there must be a rate at which it passes. Basically, if we talk about any process, then it seems to make sense to ask what rate that process occurs at. The passage of time appears to be something like a process. So what rate does it occur at? Now, the worry is that any answer the A theorist can give seems either sort of trivial or absurd, or there seems to be something suspicious or wrong with it. So if I ask you what rate does time pass at, what answer are you going to give me? You might say something, it passes at 1 hour per hour. But that sort of seems trivial, or maybe like a kind of an absurd answer. And so the B theorist will say, well, this suggests the fact that you can't say anything sensible or intelligible about the rate at which time passes maybe suggests that time doesn't pass at all. So we could give a sensible answer if we somehow had a reference point external to time itself. So, for instance, if you had two streams of time, then you can measure the passage of one stream in terms of the other stream, I suppose. So this would be like if you have two clocks, then you can sensibly talk about the time it takes a minute to elapse on clock B as measured by clock A. And they may or may not be the same. But it doesn't seem to make any sense to require that clock A measure the rate at which it takes a minute to pass according to clock A. But so far as we know, there is no second stream of time, and so no external reference point. So it seems rather hard for us to give a sensible answer to this question about what rate time passes at. And that might make you suspicious that it passes at all. There's another sort of objection to the A theory. And so, I guess many of the objections are sort of heavily against the A theory because the A theory is often taken to be the more common sense view and to be the view that maybe better captures our experience of time. So normally the sort of objections to the B view is that it can't do justice to our experience of time as passing and so on, and our common sense opinions about time. So therefore the sort of more philosophical objections, if you like, are often leveled at the A theory. So the second objection is that an objection from physics. So the special theory of relativity in particular implies that there's no absolute simultaneity. So it turns out in the special theory of relativity that what counts as simultaneous depends upon a frame of reference, and a frame of reference corresponds to a velocity. So, for instance, if I'm on Earth and you're in a spaceship traveling at a significant speed, a significant velocity, then our judgments about simultaneity are going to be very different from one another's. But you might think, whatever the present is, it's supposed to be a set of points that are simultaneous. But that means that your judgments in your spaceship about what's present are going to be very different from my judgments on Earth about what's present. And so this is just a consequence of special relativity. But this might worry or be a worry about the A theory, because according to the A theory, the property of being present, which is one of the A properties, is supposed to be metaphysically significant, right? So it's supposed to be, that there is properties of presentness, pastness, and futureness, the A properties that are real properties that can genuinely underwrite the passage of time and the existence of change. But you might think, well, anything that's just kind of relative to a frame of reference that varies depending upon velocity, you might think, well, that can't really correspond to anything metaphysically weighty. Or moreover, you might say, well, even if it does, right, don't we get contradictions, right? Because what's present relative to my frame of reference is not present relative to your frame of reference. So what are we to do? Are we to say that one of us is special, right? So actually the true present corresponds to my frame of reference rather than to yours. What grounds would we have for making that judgment on? So either we say one's special, or we say it's somehow all relative, but then it sort of seems kind of surprising that such an important property should be relativized in this way. Okay, so anyway, there's a sort of taster of the debate, and there are more considerations for and against the A theory and the B theory on the further reading list for this week, if this is a topic you're interested in. But that's it for this week. So I will speak to you all again next week. Hope you have a good time in the meantime. Okay, bye.